Hey everybody, it's Party Elite, and today we're taking a look at the latest piece of DLC for Total War Warhammer 2. 4 months after the previous DLC addition to the game, we are finally seeing some fresh additions once more with the Hunter and the Beast, a piece of DLC that brings more to the game than I'd initially anticipated. We'll get into the details over the course of this review, that's the point of these things after all, but I'd like to start with full disclosure to let you know that Creative Assembly gave me a review key, and of course, that doesn't affect my opinion. If, after watching this review, you decide to pick up a copy of the DLC, consider doing so with my Humble Bundle affiliate link that I'll include under the eye at the top right corner of the screen and in the description down below. Doing so helps support the channel as well as charity. Now, with no time to waste on introductions anymore, let's dive on in and talk about the Hunter and the Beast. As is the case with all the DLC that has released for Total War Warhammer 2, additions are made to both campaign modes, Vortex and Mortal Empires, and we also see quite a few free additions being made that you don't need to purchase the DLC for. These free additions are great and all, but we're not talking about them for this review. Instead, we're focusing on just the DLC and the changes it brings to the game, just what you're going to be paying for. As the title might imply, we're seeing the addition of 2 new playable factions. One Hunter, Markus Wulfhart, the Hunts Marshal, and the Beast, Nakai the Wanderer, legendary protector of the jungles of Lustria. While Markus Wulfhart and his Hunts Marshal's expedition is a new addition for the Empire factions, Nakai the Wanderer and his Spirit of the Jungle faction is a new addition for the Lizardmen. Both factions start fairly close to each other in the Vortex campaign. Their objectives include the destruction of the other, and both campaigns conclude with a final quest battle. The Hunts Marshal's expedition is an interesting addition to the game for a few reasons. For one, we're technically seeing a completely new faction being added to Total War Warhammer 2. Now, the Empire has been available as a faction for those of you who own both Total War Warhammer 1 and 2, only if you play in the Mortal Empires campaign. Now, with this DLC, with relatively reduced amounts of effort required, the Empire is actually getting a sub-faction added to Game 2, with all of its units, regiments of renown, and 7 new units and regiments of renown on top of that, and plus, you can play them in the Vortex campaign. A smaller map, sure, but with many benefits, such as reduced turn times and a shorter, arguably sweeter, campaign length, depending on what you're looking for. It's nice to have the option, and it also gives the Empire an interesting starting position in Lustria if you're playing in the Mortal Empires campaign, allowing you to experience all the Game 2 factions a lot more easily. It's pretty interesting because, again, I call it a minimal effort approach to the DLC, which might explain the relatively low price point, but the Empire has basically been transplanted in all of its existing form into Game 2, with some added benefits, of course, of new campaign mechanics and all. We'll get into that in just a moment's time, and that's where all the extra effort for this DLC comes in, from CA's part, of course. Now, apart from all of that, as mentioned before, the Empire is also getting some new units and corresponding regiments of renown added to their roster, and these new units all seem like fun opportunities for exploring options like Vanguard deployment with stalking, with some additions allowing for mobile artillery platforms, or just some fun skirmish-centered gameplay. The units all look good, with the War Wagon and its variants being among my favorite additions in this DLC, and they certainly feel like they all have their place in armies depending on the foe, a good thing for single and multiplayer gameplay. Apart from new units and regiments of renown being added to the general roster, we also see a new classification of unit that is only available to the Hunts Marshal's expedition in the campaign through Imperial supplies, and we also see the addition of 4 new unique Hunter characters as agents, each with their own sets of story-driven missions, their own unique abilities, and their own special effects for the final battle. And we also see a new type of generic general. Units from the Imperial supplies mechanic, that I'll delve into in a moment, are either from higher up the Empire tech tree than you might currently have available for recruitment, or are variants of existing Empire units, similar to Regiments of Renown in that they are visually unique and they have certain stat buffs and unique abilities, but different in that they don't start at the highest rank, meaning there's room to improve them further. Again, these and the 4 Hunters are only available in the campaign, which means Creative Assembly is able to do things here that would break multiplayer, but provide for some fun opportunities in single player. I do wish the 4 Hunters were available in multiplayer for the expedition. It would add a bit of unpredictability to the roster, especially when you're up against them in, say, a quick battle or rank battle. Units aside, the Huntsmarshal's expedition has some new campaign mechanics as well, of course, and this is where things get, in my opinion, really interesting. The core system is the Emperor's mandate and the acclaim that ties to it. Actions such as acquiring the 4 unique hunters, conquering enemy settlements, and other acts of colonial aggression garner you more acclaim. At various milestones, you'll unlock new buildings and units for recruitment, and you'll also improve the quality of Imperial supplies while hurting relations with Lizardmen. Imperial supplies are provisions from the old world that bring you new units, sometimes unique ones like I mentioned earlier, and sometimes just higher tier units that you might not yet have access to through regular recruitment channels. They come by every so often, quite a few turns apart, but as you get more aggressive, the locals get more hostile, and that increased hostility means the Empire is willing to send supplies more often. Unfortunately, that increased hostility also means that the enemy gets a lot stronger very quickly. Uncomfortably quickly. I'm not against a challenge, but I do feel like these buffs to the enemy can be a little punishing, especially considering it doesn't matter which locals you attack, they all get angry at you together. Again, I'm fine with a challenge, but the whole hostility thing and how quickly it sort of ramps up seems a little aggressive. Maybe that's just me. I just feel like it could use a little bit of balancing. Ultimately, it's a great way to reflect aspects of certain, real-world historical mentalities when it comes to colonization, but it is a little strange in its implementation. Defeating the greenskins in battle shouldn't make the Lizardmen angry. Though, I guess I'll never understand the intricacies of the Great Plan, and maybe it does make sense after all. Either way, a small nitpick in an otherwise good set of faction mechanics. Another little nitpick is the fact that the Huntsmarshal's tech tree is very similar to that of the regular Empire factions, apart from a small thing here and there. I see the logic behind that decision, trying to make the Empire factions more similar across the board, especially with their rework, but I think there's a missed opportunity for creativity here that ties into the unique needs of an expeditionary force. A neat surprise with the Huntsmarshal's expedition was the somewhat constant presence of the Old World and Imperial politics. Various events come through as buffs and subplots, and it was more than I was expecting if I'm completely honest. As always, as somebody who likes to see storytelling and role-playing aspects, I thought it was a neat touch when your expedition is affected by things going on back at home. On the flip side, I was also a little surprised that there was no equivalent to rights. Sure, every faction doesn't have to have one-to-one mechanics for comparison, but it seems like a strange exclusion. Imperial decrees, religious decrees, and even imperialist agendas are all suitable ways to integrate a similar mechanic, so it just seems like a strange exclusion considering the amount of thought that seems to have been put in to other aspects of the expedition's mechanics. One final issue with the Huntsmarshal's expedition has actually nothing to do with the Huntsmarshal's expedition. It just seems that the Spirit of the Jungle, that is Nakai's faction, gets eliminated very early on in the campaign. Not only that, but the Spirit of the Jungle very often grovels at the expedition's feet for peace before ultimately dying off a few turns later. It's a little anticlimactic. Like, what's next? The big bad guy of the universe is going to get headbutted into crippling anxiety? And with the Huntsmarshal's expedition taken care of, let's wander on over to Nakai's Corner, deeper in Lustria for the Vortex campaign, and all the way in Albion for the Mortal Empires campaign. This Horde faction has a few interesting tricks up its sleeves to differentiate it from pre-existing Horde factions. But before we get into all of that, it's worth mentioning that the Lizardmen also receive 8 new units, including Regiments of Renown, introducing Sacred Kroxigor, Razordawn hunting packs, and the Dread Saurians. On top of that, we get a new general type and, of course, the new faction leader, Nakai himself. It's nice to see some more beasties added to the Lizardmen roster, and it's nice to see the Kroxigors getting some love. And of course, it's very nice to see the Dread Saurian in all its glory, and in 3 forms, no less. In the campaign, the Spirit of the Jungle faction is a Horde faction, as mentioned earlier, which means they wander the land, never settling down in one place. This makes for a somewhat faster pace of play as you're not managing multiple cities you conquer, instead handing them off to the vassal faction you start with, the Defenders of the Great Plan. This vassal faction acts as your source of income through tribute, and it also means that there's actual territory that you control by extension. When you conquer a city, you can choose which of the 3 old ones to dedicate it to, each one focusing on different aspects and styles of play. As you dedicate more temples to specific old ones, you'll leave behind thematically appropriate garrisons, and you'll unlock the options for more boons and blessed spawnings from the old one in question, boons that you can obtain or use by spending points known as Favor of the Old Ones. Points that are gained by pursuing standard campaign gameplay of conquering and defeating the enemy, etc., etc. So, without cities of your own, you invest in horde growth and horde infrastructure, buildings that your horde carries with it. When it comes to recruiting and unlocking units, Nakai's own army can build buildings for recruitment, while the other armies in the faction globally recruit from Nakai's horde. This creates a nice thematic implication, and it also means you're limited by global recruitment rates and limitations, which is why these other armies are able to construct buildings to speed up global recruitment. Makes sense. We also see 3 new rights exclusive to the Spirit of the Jungle, and we also see a different tech tree. Now, there's some overlapping technologies, sure, but the tree itself is different and more suited to the Horde-style gameplay. Finally, playing as Nakai actually gives the Huntsmarshal's expedition a much better start, particularly because all the 4 unique hunter characters that the Huntsmarshal seeks begin under his command when you're playing as Nakai. Not only that, but when playing as Nakai, you are required to eliminate all 4 of the hunters by tracking them down and defeating their armies in battle. I will say, Nakai's campaign additions seem less compelling than Markus, a little lacklustria in comparison, perhaps. In all seriousness, it's not bad, and there are some new elements like Temples of the Old Ones, but it's not as interesting as all the fancy stuff that Markus gets. Imperial supplies, the Emperor's mandate, the events based on politics back home, hostility. Just kind of feels like the Empire got more love. Again, I wouldn't say that Nakai and the Spirit of the Jungle are boring or bad, but it definitely feels like the Empire was more fleshed out and more thought out, and I think that's probably a direct result of the fact that the Empire is technically a new faction to Total War Warhammer 2, specifically. Now, as many of you are aware, I don't really do numerical scores when it comes to reviews. They always feel a little arbitrary, and they bring up random comparisons between games. I much prefer to focus on the value for money aspect and the fun factor that comes with any particular game, or in this case, DLC. For $10, it's really very hard to go wrong. The DLC is building on a strong foundation with 2 new factions, 15 new units, a variety of new mechanics, some very well thought out. Playing as Nakai was fast and fun, playing as Markus was a bit more cautious and daunting. One is an easy start with Nakai, and one is a hard start where everybody hates you as the expeditionary force. Both factions have interesting quest battles, both new faction leaders have some interesting abilities and skills. The 4 hunters and their storylines make for a compelling idea, and overall, I'm happy to see this kind of storytelling and these kinds of mechanics coming out of Creative Assembly. Sidebar, I want to see this creativity applied to historical titles as well. Now, if you're even remotely interested in getting more mileage out of the Lizardmen, this is definitely worth getting. On top of that, as somebody who wasn't previously interested in the Empire's mechanics, the Huntsmarshal's expedition is single-handedly, in my opinion, reason enough to get this DLC. I hope this review gives you some insight into the DLC and helps you decide whether you want to pick it up or not. As always, I welcome any questions and thoughts in the comments down below. A big thanks goes out to all of my channel members and patrons who help keep this channel alive on a monthly basis, and of course, a big thanks goes out to each and every one of you for watching. Until next time, cheers.